The dust cloud appeared at first light, a brown stain on the horizon that moved with a purpose too direct, too focused, to be a herd of buffalo. From the porch of the isolated ranch house, 17-year-old Caleb Mercer watched it grow, his heart thudding a slow, dread-filled rhythm against his ribs. As the cloud drew closer, it resolved into shapes. Riders, dozens of them. Their ponies were painted for war, and the morning sun glinted off the feathers in their hair. But they did not ride like a war party. They moved in a solemn, processional line, and at their center, a man rode alone, his bearing radiating an authority that silenced the prairie itself. Even from a distance, Caleb knew. This was Chief Dakota, leader of the Hunkpapa Lakota, the most powerful and feared Sioux chief in the territory, and trailing behind him, held by young warriors on a long rawhide line, was a sight that made no sense. Not a single war pony, but a vast herd of horses, 50, 60, maybe 80 strong. Their coats a shifting tapestry of bays, paints, and duns in the rising sun. They were not here for a raid. They were here for him. Caleb's father, Josiah Mercer, stepped out onto the porch, his shotgun in hand. His face, already hardened by a lifetime of loss and struggle, was a mask of grim fury. "I told you," he snarled at his son without taking his eyes off the approaching Sioux. "I told you bringing that Indian here would bring nothing but trouble. Now you've brought death to our door." Caleb said nothing. His throat was too tight with a fear that was mixed with a strange, defiant certainty. He looked past the armed riders, past the fearsome chief, to the herd of horses. This wasn't a threat. It was a statement. But what kind of statement he couldn't begin to fathom. The choice he'd made yesterday, a split-second decision in a canyon, had not brought the revenge he feared. It had brought a terrifying, magnificent mystery to his doorstep. Flashback, 24 hours earlier. The canyon was Caleb's escape. It was the one place the failure of his father's ranch, the constant bitterness in the house, and the weight of a future with no prospects couldn't reach him. He was checking the few pathetic traps he'd set, hoping for a rabbit to supplement their meager meals, when the sound reached him. Not the normal sounds of the canyon, the sigh of wind through pines, the chatter of a squirrel, but a high, terrified scream followed by the deep, guttural snarls of a predator. He ran, his boots skidding on loose rock, his own .22 rifle feeling like a toy in his hands. He rounded a bend in the canyon wall and froze. The scene before him was a brutal snapshot of life on the frontier. A large timber wolf, its ribs showing through its gray coat, had cornered a boy against the cliff face. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old. He was Sioux, his long black hair matted with dust, his small frame trembling as he held a stick out in front of him like a sword. The wolf, desperate with hunger, lunged. It wasn't a thought process. It was pure instinct. Caleb didn't weigh the consequences, the politics, the certain fury of his father. He saw a child about to be torn apart. "Hey!" he roared, his voice echoing off the stone walls. The wolf spun, its yellow eyes locking onto this new threat. It was between Caleb and the boy. Caleb's hands were shaking so badly he could barely cock the tiny rifle. It was a varmint gun, meant for rabbits and squirrels, not a 100-pound wolf. He fired. The crack of the .22 was pitifully small. He missed. The wolf flinched, then bared its teeth, a low, continuous growl rumbling in its chest. It took a step toward him. Caleb stood his ground, his mind screaming at him to run. He fired again. This time the bullet grazed the wolf's haunch. It yelped in surprise and pain, its predatory focus broken. For a heartbeat, it stared at Caleb, then back at the boy. With a final, frustrated snarl, it turned and limped away into the deeper shadows of the canyon. Silence returned, heavy and ringing. The Sioux boy was still pressed against the rock, his chest heaving. Caleb approached slowly, his hands up. "It's okay," he said, his voice trembling. "It's gone. You're safe." The boy didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He lowered his stick. His eyes, wide with terror, were fixed on Caleb. Then Caleb saw the boy's leg. A deep, bloody gash ran from his knee to his ankle. He must have fallen or been caught by the wolf's claws during the struggle. He couldn't walk. Caleb's dilemma crystallized in that moment. He could leave the boy here. He could go home, tell no one, and let the Sioux deal with their own. It was the smart thing, the safe thing, the thing his father would have demanded. But he looked at the boy's leg. at the blood seeping into the dust. He looked at the trust slowly replacing the fear in the child's eyes. This boy had a family, a mother, a father, and Caleb knew the hollow ache of loss all too well. His own mother was a ghost in his memory. Without a word, Caleb slung his rifle over his shoulder and knelt. He gestured to his back. The boy hesitated for only a second before understanding. He wrapped his thin arms around Caleb's neck. He was light, but the weight of the decision felt immense. Caleb carried him out of the canyon, the boy's quiet, pained breaths the only sound between them. He was carrying the boy away from the wolves of the wilderness and straight into the jaws of a different kind of beast entirely, the bitter prejudice of his own world. The walk back to the ranch was the longest of Caleb's life. Each step was weighted with the burden of the boy on his back and the certainty of the storm waiting for him at home. The boy, whom he learned was named Maddo, meaning bear, clung to him with a trust that was both touching and terrifying. He spoke no English, but his small hands gripping Caleb's shoulders spoke a universal language of dependence. As the Mercer Ranch came into view, a cluster of weathered buildings clinging stubbornly to the vast prairie, Caleb's stomach tightened into a knot. His father, Josiah, was standing in the yard, sharpening an axe on a grindstone. The screech of metal on stone stopped abruptly as he saw them approach. Josiah stood up slowly, his eyes narrowing from Caleb to the Sioux boy on his back, then back to Caleb. The expression on his face was not one of curiosity or concern, but of pure undiluted fury. "What in God's name have you done?" Josiah's voice was low, a dangerous rumble that carried across the yard. Caleb gently set Maddo down on an upturned crate by the water trough. A wolf had him cornered in the canyon. "He's hurt." Josiah Mercer took 2 long strides forward, his work-roughened hand shooting out to grip Caleb's arm with bruising force. "I don't care if a grizzly bear had him. You brought an Indian onto my land? Have you lost your mind, boy?" "He's a child, Pa," Caleb said, trying to keep his voice steady. "He was going to die, then let him die." Josiah snarled, his face inches from Caleb's. "That's their way. You think his people would have done any different for you? They'd have taken your scalp and been done with it." He shoved Caleb backward, his gaze sweeping over Maddo's leg. "Look at him. He's a Sioux. That means his father is probably a warrior. You think he's going to thank you for this? He's going to see this as a weakness, an insult. He'll come here with his whole damn tribe and burn us out." Maddo watched the exchange with wide, frightened eyes, understanding the anger if not the words. He shrank back against the trough. "He doesn't understand, Pa. He's just a kid," Caleb pleaded, his own temper starting to simmer. "I couldn't leave him. You could have and you should have," Josiah roared. "This isn't a charity, Caleb. This is survival. We are hanging on by our fingernails out here. And you go and bring a war down on our heads for what? For a savage?" The word hung in the air, ugly and final. Caleb felt a hot flush of shame, not for his actions, but for his father's. He turned his back on Josiah and knelt beside Maddo. "Ignore him," he said softly, though he knew the boy couldn't understand. He dipped a rag in the water trough and began to gently clean the gash on Maddo's leg. The wound was deep and dirt and gravel were embedded in it. It needed proper cleaning, stitches, and a poultice to prevent infection. Josiah watched in stony silence for a minute, then spat into the dust. "You fix him up and then he goes. I don't care where. You take him back to the canyon and leave him, but he is not spending the night under my roof. You hear me?" Caleb didn't answer. He kept working, his focus entirely on Maddo. He cleaned the wound as best he could with water and a little whiskey from the barn, the boy wincing but not crying out. Caleb marveled at his bravery. He found a needle and thread in his mother's old sewing kit, a relic he wasn't supposed to touch, and, with hands that trembled only slightly, managed to put in a few crude stitches to close the worst of the cut. He wrapped it in a clean strip of cloth torn from an old sheet. The first complication arrived not with a shout, but with the sound of an approaching wagon. Josiah stiffened. "Damn it, it's Henderson." Old Man Henderson was their nearest neighbor, 5 miles to the east. He was a gossip and a known Indian hater, his prejudice forged in the fires of past conflicts. If he saw Maddo, the news would be all over the territory by nightfall. "Get him in the barn." "Now," Josiah hissed. Caleb didn't need to be told twice. He scooped Maddo up and hurried into the relative darkness of the barn. settling him in a pile of fresh hay in an empty stall. "Stay quiet," he whispered, putting a finger to his lips. Matto nodded, understanding the gesture. From the crack in the barn door, Caleb watched as Henderson's wagon rolled into the yard. The old man climbed down, his eyes immediately darting around with a nosy curiosity. "Josiah," Henderson greeted, his voice raspy. "Heard a shot from the canyon direction earlier. Everything all right?" "Everything's fine, Eli," Josiah said, crossing his arms and positioning himself squarely between Henderson and the barn. "Just scaring off a coyote." Henderson's eyes lingered on the barn for a moment too long. "Coyote, huh? Thought I saw something. Or someone moving near your barn just now." Caleb's blood ran cold. Had Matto shifted in the hay? "Your eyes are playing tricks on you, old man," Josiah said, his voice tight. "Probably just a shadow." Henderson wasn't convinced. He took a step toward the barn. "You sure about that, Josiah? You know, there's been Sioux signs spotted south of here. A hunting party, they say. Wouldn't want none of them sneaking around your place." The standoff felt like it lasted an hour. Josiah didn't budge. "My place is my business, Eli. Now, if you don't mind, I've got work to do." Henderson finally nodded, a slow, suspicious gesture. "Suit yourself. But you see any Sioux, you let the rest of us know. We got a right to protect what's ours." He climbed back into his wagon and drove off, but he looked back 3 times before he disappeared from view. When the wagon was gone, Josiah stormed into the barn. His face was pale with a mixture of anger and fear. "You see," he seethed at Caleb. "You see what you've done? If Henderson had seen that boy, he'd have ridden straight to the fort. They'd have sent soldiers. There'd be a hanging for sure. Maybe for both of us. He's gone now," Caleb said, but the relief was short-lived. The second complication announced itself with a soft, pained moan from the hay. Matto's face was flushed and a sheen of sweat coated his brow. Caleb touched the boy's forehead. It was burning up. The infection from the wound had set in, fast and fierce. The crude stitches and whiskey weren't enough. "He's got a fever," Caleb said, his voice thick with worry. Josiah stared at the sick child, and for a fleeting moment, Caleb saw a crack in his father's hard exterior, a flicker of something that might have been pity. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar, hard pragmatism. "Then he'll die," Josiah said, his voice flat and final, "and it'll be a mercy for all of us. Bury him in the canyon when it's over. I want no trace of him here." He turned and walked out of the barn, leaving Caleb alone in the dim light with the feverish boy. The weight of his isolation was crushing. He had defied his father, risked his community's wrath, and for what? To watch this brave child die in a dusty barn? Caleb looked down at Matto. The boy's eyes were glazed with fever, but they found Caleb's, and in their depths, Caleb saw a fierce will to live. It mirrored his own. He had saved Matto from the wolf. He wouldn't let him be taken by fever. He spent the night in the barn, using damp cloths to cool Matto's brow, dribbling water into his mouth, and praying to a God he wasn't sure was listening. It was a long, dark vigil, filled with the sounds of the boy's ragged breathing and the chilling howl of a distant wolf pack, a constant reminder of how thin the line was between civilization and the wild, between life and death. As the first gray light of dawn touched the sky, the fever broke. Matto's breathing eased and he fell into a deep, natural sleep. Exhausted but relieved, Caleb allowed himself to close his eyes for just a moment. He was jolted awake by the sound that would change his life forever. Not a wolf's howl, but the thunder of hooves. Dozens of them, hundreds. He scrambled to the barn door and peered out. The horizon was filled with Sioux warriors, and at their head rode a chief whose face was a carved mask of grim purpose. They had come, and they had found him. The sound was not the chaotic thunder of a charge, but the disciplined, earth-shaking rhythm of 80 horses moving as one. They crested the rise to the east, a flowing, living river of muscle and painted hides, and fanned out with a precision that stole the breath from Caleb's lungs. In the center of this formidable display, Chief Dakota sat motionless on a magnificent white and brown painted stallion. His face, etched with the lines of sun and wind, was not twisted in rage, but held a calm, unreadable authority. that was more intimidating than any war cry. From the house, Josiah Mercer burst onto the porch, his shotgun gripped white-knuckled in his hands. His face was a pale, grim mask. "I knew it," he hissed, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and vindictive fury. He raised the shotgun, aiming it roughly in the direction of the chief. "I told you, boy. I told you this would happen." "Pa, don't!" Caleb cried out, stepping from the barn, his hands raised high. "Don't shoot. Look at them. They're not attacking." It was true. The warriors had formed a wide, semicircular front, but their weapons, bows, lances, a few rifles, rested across their saddles. They were not aimed. They were waiting. Their eyes, dark and intent, were fixed not on Josiah and his shotgun, but on the barn, and on Caleb standing before it. Chief Dakota nudged his horse forward a few steps. He ignored Josiah completely, his gaze sweeping over Caleb, then past him, into the shadows of the barn. He called out a single word in Lakota, his voice deep and carrying. "Matto!" From inside the barn there was a scrambling sound. Matto, weak but determined, emerged from the doorway, leaning heavily against the frame. His face lit up at the sight of the chief, and he called back, "8, father!" The word landed in the dusty yard with the force of a revelation. Caleb felt the world tilt. The boy he had saved wasn't just any Sioux child. He was the son of the chief. The magnitude of his act and the potential consequences multiplied 100-fold in that single uttered word. Josiah Mercer understood it too. The barrel of his shotgun wavered slightly. He had been prepared to fight warriors avenging a stolen child. He was not prepared for this. Chief Dakota dismounted with a fluid, powerful grace. He still carried no weapon. He walked toward the barn, his eyes locked on his son. He knelt before Matto, his hands gently examining the boy's face, then the bandaged leg. He spoke softly in Lakota, and Matto responded, his voice eager, his small hands gesturing animatedly, pointing to the canyon, mimicking a wolf, then pointing to Caleb, and finally hugging his own chest in a universal sign of rescue. The entire ranch yard was silent, holding its breath. 80 warriors watched. A bitter, terrified rancher watched, and Caleb watched, his fate being decided in a language he couldn't understand. Finally, Chief Dakota stood. He turned, and for the first time his full attention fell upon Josiah Mercer, and the shotgun still pointed in his general direction. The chief's expression was not one of anger, but of profound disdain. He looked at the weapon as if it were a child's toy, an irrelevance. He took a step forward, then another, walking directly toward Josiah. "Do not take another step," Josiah shouted, his voice shrill with panic. Dakota did not stop. He walked until the twin barrels of the shotgun were almost touching the intricate bone and bead breastplate he wore. He looked Josiah directly in the eye, his own gaze as steady and deep as a mountain lake. "If you were going to use it, white man, it would already be done," the chief said, his English heavily accented but perfectly clear. He reached out, not in a threat, but with a slow, deliberate motion, and placed his hand on the shotgun's barrels, pushing them gently down toward the earth. Josiah, stunned by the sheer audacity and authority of the act, offered no resistance. The weapon pointed harmlessly at the ground. The chief then turned his back on Josiah, a gesture of utter contempt and supreme confidence. He walked toward Caleb. The warriors on the ridge remained motionless, but Caleb could feel their collective focus intensify. "You," the chief said, stopping before Caleb. "You are the one who fought the wolf for my son." Caleb could only nod, his throat too tight for words. "Matto says you carried him. You cleaned his wound. You fought the fever in the night." The chief's eyes scanned Caleb's face, searching for something. "He says you were not afraid." "I was afraid," Caleb whispered, finding his voice. "I was terrified." A flicker of what might have been respect crossed the chief's face. A man who admits fear is braver than one who claims to have none. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the poor, run-down ranch. "My son also says your father wanted to leave him to die, that he called him a savage." Caleb glanced at his father, who stood shamed and silent by the porch, the shotgun hanging limply in his hand. There was no point in lying. "Yes," Caleb said simply. Chief Dakota nodded slowly, as if this confirmed a deeply held belief. The wolf in the canyon was hungry. It acted from its nature. "It is easy to understand." He turned his head slightly, casting a glance back at Josiah. The wolf in a man's heart is harder to understand. Its hunger makes no sense. The insult was delivered with such calm finality that it didn't even sound like an insult, but a simple statement of fact. Josiah flinched as if he'd been struck. The chief turned his attention fully back to Caleb. My people have a law. It is older than the horse, older than the first treaty with the white man. It is called the Wakangyeja Thipi, the law of the wolf brother. Caleb's heart began to pound again. This was it. The judgment. The law says, Dakota continued, his voice taking on a formal, ritualistic tone, that when a stranger risks his own life to save a child from the wolf, not the animal, but any great danger, a sacred bond is created. The one who saves the child becomes a brother to the child, and a brother to the child's father. He gestured to the vast herd of horses being held by his warriors. The animals shifted and stamped, a fortune in wealth and mobility on the hoof. A brother's life cannot be paid for with trinkets. It cannot be paid for with promises. It can only be honored with a gift of equal spirit, with something that gives life and freedom and strength. He looked from Caleb to his own son, then back again. These 80 horses are for you. They are the honor price for my son's life. They are for the boy who became my son's wolf brother. The air left Caleb's lungs. 80 horses. It was a king's ransom. It was more wealth than his family had ever seen. It would transform their desperate existence overnight. He stared at the chief, unable to process the magnitude of the offer. From the porch, Josiah Mercer made a strangled sound. The greed in his eyes was immediate and overwhelming, momentarily eclipsing his fear and prejudice. 80 horses could save the ranch. They could make him a rich man, but Chief Dakota's eyes were still fixed on Caleb. And in them, Caleb saw that the gift was not for his father. It was not for the Mercer Ranch. It was for him alone. It was a test of his character, just as saving Matto had been. The chief had not come for war. He had not come for revenge. He had come to repay a sacred debt in the most profound way his culture knew how. He had brought 80 horses to the doorstep of a broken rancher, all for the courage of a boy who had done the right thing. The confrontation was over. The real challenge was just beginning. The silence in the wake of Chief Dakota's pronouncement was absolute, broken only by the soft snort of a horse and the whisper of the wind across the prairie. 80 horses. The number echoed in Caleb's mind, a sum so vast it felt abstract. He looked at the herd, a living, breathing sea of wealth that could erase years of failure from this land. Then he looked at his father. Josiah Mercer's face was a battlefield of warring emotions. The raw, avaricious glee at the sight of such, fortune warred with the deep-seated humiliation of having been so thoroughly shamed and dismissed by the Sioux chief. His knuckles were white where he still gripped the useless shotgun. He took a step forward, his voice a strained croak. The boy, he began, gesturing vaguely at Caleb. He's my son. What's his it's mine. The horses, they belong to this ranch. Chief Dakota did not even turn to look at him. His gaze remained fixed on Caleb, his eyes holding a question that went far beyond the transaction of livestock. He was waiting to see if the boy who had the courage to face a wolf had the wisdom to understand the true nature of this gift. The gift is not for the land, the chief said, his voice quiet but carrying with absolute clarity. It is not for the roof or the fences. It is for the heart that beat against the wolf's snarl. It is for the hands that carried my son. The law of the wolf brother is a law of the spirit. It does not recognize the claims of a man who would have left my son to the fever. The rebuke was as sharp as a skinning knife and just as precise. Josiah flinched, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. He was being cut out publicly and utterly from the redemption of his own failing world. Caleb understood. This was the true climax, not the standoff with the warriors, but this moment of choice. He could accept the horses as simple payment, a fortune that would lift his family from poverty. But to do so would be to misunderstand everything. It would make the act of saving Matto a transaction, cheapening the sacred bond the chief spoke of. He would become what his father was, a man who saw the world only in terms of what he could take from it. He looked at Matto, who was now standing straighter, his small hand resting on his father's arm. The boy gave Caleb a slow, solemn nod, as if urging him to understand the path being offered. "The horses," Caleb began, his voice hesitant. He looked at the magnificent animals, then back at Chief Dakota. "They are a great honor, but I didn't save Matto for horses." A murmur, this time of approval, rippled through the line of warriors. Josiah made a sound of pure, strangled fury. Chief Dakota's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I know," he said. "That is why you are worthy of them. Speak your heart, wolf brother." Caleb took a deep breath, the words forming from a place of truth he hadn't known was there. "A gift like this, it's a seed. If I take it just for myself, it's just wealth. It might last a season or a year." He glanced at his father, whose eyes were burning with hatred. "But if it's a bridge, if it's a start, then it could last forever." He turned fully to face the chief, his own resolve solidifying. "I accept your gift, Chief Dakota, but I accept it as a bridge between your people and mine. This ranch has been a place of hunger and fear. Let it become a place of meeting. Let these horses be the start of a herd that both our peoples tend. Let this be a place where your hunters can trade hides, where your people can find shelter, and where my people can learn that the Sioux are not the monsters our fear tells us they are." He was no longer just a boy talking to a chief. He was one man proposing a treaty to another. The audacity of it hung in the air. Chief Dakota was silent for a long time, studying Caleb with an intensity that seemed to peel back the layers of his soul. The entire valley waited on his verdict. Finally he spoke, and his words were not those of a leader to a child, but of one equal to another. "Your words have wisdom that shames men twice your age," the chief said, his voice thick with an emotion that went beyond respect. "You see the future not as a thing to be taken, but as a thing to be built. This is the way of a true leader." He took a step forward and placed his hands on Caleb's shoulders. The gesture was paternal, powerful, and final. "The gift is accepted in the spirit it was offered. The horses are yours, Caleb Mercer, to build your herd, to build your future, and to build this bridge." He turned his head, and for the first time since his arrival, he directly addressed Josiah Mercer. His tone was not confrontational, but it carried the weight of an unbreakable law. "The boy, Caleb, is now my son as surely as he is yours. He is wolf brother to Matto, and so he is a son of my heart. The horses are his. His word on their use is law. If you try to take them from him, you are not just stealing from your son. You are stealing from me, and you are stealing from the Hunkpapa Lakota." He didn't need to elaborate on the consequence. It was written in the faces of the 80 warriors behind him. Josiah Mercer's dream of seizing the fortune for himself evaporated in that moment, replaced by the cold, terrifying understanding that his own son was now under the protection of a power greater than any sheriff or cavalry fort. The climax had passed, the tension shattered. Chief Dakota gave a signal, and a group of young warriors began expertly driving the herd of 80 horses toward the Mercers' corrals and pastures. The sight of such life and vitality flowing into the barren ranch was breathtaking. As the warriors worked, Chief Dakota drew Caleb aside. "The bridge you speak of will not be easy to build," he said quietly. "There will be suspicion from your people and from mine. There will be those like your father and like Henderson who will try to burn it down." "I know," Caleb said, watching the magnificent animals fill his family's empty land. "But you will not build it alone," the chief said. "You have a brother now, and you have a father who will watch over you." He gestured to the horses. "This is not the end of the story, Caleb. It is the first word on a new page." With the herd settled and the new bond solemnized, Chief Dakota mounted his stallion. Matto, now riding a small pony of his own, waved at Caleb, his face beaming with pride and health. "We will return when the moon is full," the chief said, "to see the progress of the bridge." And with that, the Sioux turned and rode away, leaving behind not the silence of threat, but the vibrant, hopeful noise of 80 horses and the blueprint of a future Caleb had dared to imagine. The silence that settled over the ranch after the Sioux departed was of a completely different quality than before. It was no longer the heavy, empty silence of failure, but a vibrant, pregnant quiet, filled with the sounds of new life. The snorts and whinnies of 80 horses, the stamp of their hooves in the corrals, the rustle of them grazing on the prairie grass that was already seeming greener. These were the sounds of a miracle. For Josiah Mercer, the miracle felt like a condemnation. He stood on his porch, a solitary figure, watching the wealth he had craved now fill his land, entirely under the control of the son he had misunderstood and the tribe he had despised. He had not spoken a word to Caleb since the Sioux left. The shame was a physical weight on his shoulders, bending his already stooped frame. Caleb, for his part, gave his father space. He threw himself into the work, his heart soaring with a purpose he had never known. The horses were not just animals. They were a responsibility, a promise. He worked from dawn until dusk, mending fences with a new determination, digging a new, deeper well, and learning the nature of each horse in the herd. He saw the trust in their eyes and understood it was a reflection of the trust Chief Dakota and Matto had placed in him. A week after the gift, as Caleb was repairing a gate hinge, his father approached. Josiah's movements were hesitant, his eyes fixed on the ground. "The bay mare with the white sock," Josiah said, his voice rough from disuse. "She's favoring her left foreleg. Might be a stone bruise." Caleb looked up, surprised. It was the first civil word his father had spoken to him in days. He nodded. "I'll check on her." "Thank you, Pa." Josiah gave a curt nod and turned to leave, but then he stopped. He didn't turn around, but his words carried back to Caleb on the thin breeze. "You were right. And I was wrong." It wasn't an embrace. It wasn't a tearful reconciliation. But in the language of stubborn, broken men, it was a seismic shift. It was the first stone laid in a new foundation between them. The next month saw the transformation of the Mercer Ranch into something the territory had never seen. True to his word, when the moon was full, Chief Dakota returned, not with his entire band, but with a small group of hunters and their families. They brought buffalo hides and beautifully crafted tools. Caleb had prepared a space for trading, a simple awning stretched between two posts. The exchange was cautious at first, conducted with silent nods and gestures. But as the Sioux saw the respect with which Caleb cared for the horses, and as the few Mercer neighbors who dared to visit saw the quality of the goods, the bridge began to solidify. The ranch became a neutral ground, a tiny island of truce in a sea of historical conflict. Caleb, fluent now in a few key Lakota words and a lot of hand signals, was the interpreter, the peacemaker. His father, slowly shedding the armor of his bitterness, found a new purpose in his unsurpassed knowledge of livestock, showing the Sioux riders techniques for treating equine ailments they had never encountered. One evening, nearly a year after the wolf in the canyon, Caleb and Josiah sat on the porch together. The ranch was prosperous, the herd had grown, and the sound of laughter from both white and Sioux children playing near the corrals was a regular melody. "I spent my whole life fighting this land. Fighting the weather, fighting them," Josiah said, nodding toward the Sioux children. "I thought strength was in holding on and pushing back." He looked at his son, his eyes for the first time in years clear and calm. "You showed me that strength is in building something new, even if it's with the pieces you thought were your enemies." Caleb smiled. "They were never the enemy, Pa, just people. Like us." The following spring, Chief Dakota and Matto arrived for their regular visit. Matto, now strong and tall for his age, ran to Caleb, not with the formal respect of a chief's son, but with the unbridled joy of a younger brother. "Wolf brother," he yelled, his English much improved. After the formal greetings, Chief Dakota took Caleb and Josiah to the highest ridge on the property. He pointed to the bustling ranch below, the full corrals, the new barn they had built together, the smoke rising from the cooking fires of a visiting Sioux family. "You see?" the chief said, a deep satisfaction in his voice. "One boy's courage did this. One act of compassion, stronger than 100 battles, has made this valley a place of peace." He placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder and looked at Josiah. "You have a son who is a bridge builder. That is a greater legacy than any cattle baron's empire." In that moment, looking down at the world he had helped create, Caleb Mercer understood the true meaning of the gift. The 80 horses were not the reward, they were the tool. The reward was the life he now lived, a life of purpose, of family restored, and of a friendship that had rewritten the destiny of a small corner of the frontier. He was no longer the rancher's son who had saved a Sioux boy. He was Caleb Mercer, the wolf brother, the man who had been given everything because he had been willing to give everything he had for a stranger in a canyon. History is not just written by the victors of wars, but by the quiet victors over fear. The greatest courage is not found in the heat of battle, but in the solitary moment when you choose compassion over prejudice, and in doing so, discover that the enemy you feared was a friend waiting to be made, and the fortune you sought was a future waiting to be built, together. If you found yourself in that canyon, would you have had the courage to face the wolf? Let us know in the comments. And if this story of a single choice that changed an entire world moved you, then you cannot miss the video we have for you on screen right now. It's another incredible tale where destiny hinges on a moment of impossible bravery. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story that proves the smallest acts cast the longest shadows.